I get a lot of comments from people online learning how to crochet. I taught myself how to crochet, I've taught a lot of my friends how to crochet, and I've noticed some common threads amongst beginners learning how to crochet and the things that they struggle with. So here are the 5 mistakes I see most beginners make when they're learning how to crochet and what to do about them. So number 5 is skipping stitches or adding stitches, also not counting your stitches at the end of your rows. So when you're learning how to crochet, it's really easy to accidentally work 2 stitches into 1 stitch of the row below, and that would be adding a stitch, or skipping over one of the stitches in the row below that you were supposed to work your crochet stitch into, and that would be skipping a stitch. So if you're working in the flat, you're making a square or a rectangle, you will notice that your edges will get really wonky. So they'll go in or they'll go out, or a little bit of both maybe, and that's not what you want. You want flat, straight edges. So a way to get around unknowingly adding or skipping stitches is to count your stitches at the end of each row. So as you go row by row by row, your stitches at the end should stay the same, especially if you're just working with single crochets, half double crochets, double crochets. If your first row was 22 stitches, the next row should be 22 stitches, and the next one, and the next one. So a quick lesson on counting your stitches. You can see that these are the tops of the stitches because they have a front and a back loop. They look like interlocking chains like you would see on a necklace chain. I like to focus on the top of the stitches when I'm counting. Let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So if you're struggling with your rows looking wonky and your edges going in and out, make sure you count your stitches at the end of each row. Number 4 is not knowing where to work your last stitch of the row. So for some stitch patterns, you're supposed to work your last stitch into the turning chain of the row below. But for most stitches, you're supposed to work your last stitch into the last stitch of the row below. And sometimes for beginners, it's hard to see where this is. So I'm going to show you an example right here of what it would look like to work your last stitch into the last stitch of the row below versus working into the turning chain. So you can see that this is the turning chain. You can see the chains there, and it doesn't have a visible like top with the 2 loops that we saw earlier. And it's harder to squeeze your hook into the turning chain than an actual stitch. And hopefully you can see the difference there. So unless your pattern indicates that your turning chain counts as a stitch, like sometimes it'll say that this chain 2 counts as a double crochet, unless it says that, or specifically to work your last stitch into the turning chain, work your last stitch into the last stitch of the row below, not the turning chain. Number 3 is working your stitches into either the front loop only or the back loop only. I'm going to show you here how on the top of each crochet stitch there are 2 loops. You have the back loop and you have the front loop. And for most crochet stitches, you are working your stitch through both of those loops. I've noticed that a lot of beginner crocheters, when they're introduced to the single crochet back loop only, which is one of the only stitches where you're working into the back loop or the front loop really, they will be like, oh, I've been doing it this way the whole time. I didn't know that I was doing it wrong. So for most of the time when you're crocheting, you're inserting your hook through both of those loops and working your stitches like that. Number 2 is starting with a project or a pattern instead of practice. When you're learning to crochet, always start with practice before you start with a pattern. Beginner level patterns are not there to teach you how to crochet. They're there to be a first stepping stone into working a crochet pattern. Most beginner crochet patterns are not going to teach you how to crochet a chain, how to turn, how to work a single crochet, double crochet, etc. So go find a YouTube tutorial. You can find some of mine here, or any tutorial or book that makes sense to you. I find most people find video the easiest way to learn, but learn how to crochet a chain first, and then how to single crochet, half double crochet, double crochet, treble crochet, and slip stitch. Those are the basic crochet stitches, and once you have a real handle on those, and you know how to turn, and your edges aren't wonky like we talked about, you know that you're putting your crochet hook in the right spot, and your stitches aren't really tight or really loose or varying as you go along your gauge, which is the tension of your crochet stitches, how tight or loose they are, that tension is pretty even, then you can think about learning how to read a crochet pattern and then taking on your first crochet project through a pattern. but really practice first. You can just work up multiple swatches or those little squares of single crochets, double crochets, as you learn those basic crochet stitches. If you try to take on a pattern right off the bat, you're probably going to be frustrated because that's not what the pattern's for. Pattern's for being your first crochet pattern that you do, not teaching you how to crochet. And then you might, hopefully not, but you might just give up the craft altogether, being like, this is too hard, I can't do it. Throw it all out. Also, I know starting a new craft is really exciting. Some of the creativity and even maximalism that comes with yarn crafts can be really enticing, but I really encourage you, when you go to the craft store or when you're shopping online, just get worsted weight yarn. So it should say weight 4. It should look about like this in terms of like how thick the yarn is, and see how smooth that yarn is. That's what you want your first yarn that you practice and learn on to be like. Don't get something super fluffy because it's going to be harder to see your stitches. Get like a really smooth, either wool or acrylic or a wool acrylic blend yarn, and a size I crochet hook. And the inescapable mistake I see pretty much every beginner make, and this is crocheting too tight. So your stitches look really, really tight. It's even kind of painful to crochet to begin with because you're trying to stab your crochet hook into your stitches instead of it just working really effortlessly and smoothly and it being relaxing. You took this up, it's supposed to be a relaxing hobby, and you feel like it's just so tight and tense and like a workout almost. That's not how it's supposed to be. If your stitches are too tight, your form might look like this, where you are taking your crochet hook almost perpendicular to your work and then stabbing, like I said earlier, your crochet hook in there. And then maybe you're even wrapping your yarn really tight around the hook and you're pulling it through. Keep it all tight. It's like you're almost making a knot instead of just a nice little relaxing stitch. And what we're doing here is not knotting things up. We are crocheting. It should be relaxing. It shouldn't hurt your hands. So try this instead. Insert your hook from an angle to the best of your ability. If your work is really tight, then it's kind of hard to crochet with good form, but try to insert from an angle like that. Catch your yarn, hold it loosely, and then pull it through your stitch. And then when you yarn over again, keep it nice and loose and pull through those 2 loops. This is a single crochet. See how much bigger that looser stitch is than all these tight stitches? So your stuff will work up quicker too because your stitches won't be so small and tight. So just remember, insert from an angle and keep all your yarn overs loose. But just consciously crochet as loose as you can. Eventually you'll figure it out and your tension will be really smooth and consistent as you crochet. And you want to get to that place, really, really you do, before you take on a project, because your crochet project isn't going to turn out well if your tension is all over the place. So practice and practice and practice until your tension is very consistent before you take on a crochet project if you want it to look good in the end. Eventually the language of crochet will be like your second language. You'll know how to read a crochet pattern. You'll know what SC means and BOL means and all these different crochet terms that you might look at now and be like, what is that? I'm too tired. I thought this was supposed to be relaxing. Why is this so hard? And it does become relaxing, but you do have to learn before you get to the relaxing part. So those are 5 of the most common mistakes I see beginners make when they're learning how to crochet and what to do about them. Let me know in the comments which one of these you struggled with the most or are currently struggling with, or if it was something else you struggled with when learning how to crochet, or currently, let me know in the comments as well. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok for bite-sized crochet tutorials, and you can find all of my patterns for sale on Etsy. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any coming tutorials or learning content like this. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.